Hey guys, how are you all doing? Surprise, surprise, I made another caster build, and right as I put it all together, FromSoft drops the 1.07 patch, and all it did was make my build even better. We have been blessed by the outer gods themselves, and they are indeed sympathetic to our cause. The age of Mage shall continue. We'll talk about the 1.07 patch in a minute. We probably won't go into a whole deep dive about it because the community is about to go full Bergenworth scholars on this and commit some atrocities in order to figure out what this patch is really all about. The bottom line is, it buffed spells, it nerfed Ashes of War across the board, and tweaked with poise a little bit. I'm not sure how, but it did. So, full disclosure, all of this footage was recorded like the day before the 1.07 patch dropped, so not all of this footage is representative of the current state of this build. In fact, what you're seeing is merely an enfeebled state of this build before 1.07 kicks its glintstone gunslinging up a notch. Now, who is this current mage in our presence today? Why, it is the Astral Collector, but in the vernacular he is known as the Bug Mage. He uses weapons like the wing of Astel, and has armor that looks like it's made up of other strange celestial creatures. I know the scale armor is supposed to be dragon scales, but let's just lean into it because it goes with the aesthetic. Because he's the Bug Mage, I originally wanted to wear one of those scarab helms, but as it turns out those are mostly just completely useless. The negation debuff makes you take 10% more damage, but the buff you do receive is like certain spells cost 15% less FP, which is not worth it in the slightest. Also, they're weirdly heavy, so let's just go with the mad alchemist vibe of a guy who collects parts of bugs from outer space. I'll post the stats and gear for this build now, since the comments have been asking for that in the last several videos, very early on. Yes, I'm using another source seal. This time it's Radagons instead of Marika's. I'm at rune level 81 with plus 17, plus 7 weapons, and with an astrologer starting class. This build was actually my rune level 37 Carrion Enforcer build that I've moved up, since now I don't need to stake out the Lascar ruins for activity thanks to patch 1.06. I will absolutely admit that this is by far the most basic mage build I've made thus far. I spent most of last week trying to make some sort of multicaster build with like faith and intelligence scaling. Ultimately I went through like 2 different attempts at a character and both just felt a little off. They were missing like 2 or 3 things that I feel like all of my builds need to function both like in an invasion but also like aesthetically. Like something needs to tie that all together, and those builds were just missing that. But what we get instead is just a very straightforward mage build with a little bit of dexterity. The general idea was that I would give myself enough dexterity to use most of the smaller Astral and Celian weapons in the game, like yes, the Wing of Astel, but also the Bastard Stars, and then dumped all of my remaining damage points into intelligence. I did this because I thought the really high intelligence sorceries would be a lot of fun, but at the end of the day, I feel like all of the really interesting and FP efficient sorceries are below 30 intelligence, and any more investment in int should just go towards your damage. The one exception I will make though is I do love me some Collapsing Stars. That spell is pretty great. If you need someone removed from a ledge, it absolutely will. That is infinitely valuable to an invader. So my goal for the little bug mage here is to use weapons that evoke a celestial aesthetic, and what weapon does that better than the Wing of Astel? Its Ashes of War, appropriately named Nebula, contributes to this a lot. Nebula has the exact same startup animation as Flame of the Redmanes, except it creates a delayed hitbox with a bunch of different explosions, all of which deal magic damage. This is just extremely useful, especially when in tight corridors, when you need to control space, or just when you want to trap your opponents in an exploding star system of damage. Now, obviously the Wing of Astel is best known for its R2s that fire short-range beams of magic damage, without costing any FP, and a surprise to nobody, those are still quite good. I see players use the R2s as like a stand-in for their spells, but they're not really supposed to be used like that. The short range of the beams make it actually pretty much impossible to hit anything from a decent distance. That's why they're really useful as a general deterrent against other players rather than something to aggress with. If you learn the timing on this weapon and throw out R2 beams frequently, it essentially extends your effective melee range by the distance of those beams. And ideally, those hits will land with both the beam and the blade if your opponent is slightly closer, which does even more damage. And since pretty much all R2s in this game have decent poise damage, it can actually stun most of your opponents who are trying to push you. Ultimately what I thought was just going to be like a basic mage weapon that has a gimmick to it, ended up being something extremely valuable that can both control space, extend effective melee range, and do some pretty decent damage while you're at it. As a backup soft swap weapon, I've also been using Rogier's Rapier with the Ash of War that comes with the weapon, that being Glintblade Phalanx. Now, for lore reasons, I should be using the Antspur Rapier with Glintblade Phalanx, but I just couldn't bring myself to do it. Like, I'm the bug mage, I should be using the stinger of an ant. Yes, of course, I should be doing that, but I feel bad using that weapon. Rot is one of those status effects that, like I've said a million times, just has no business being on a rapier, but it just fits too much sense aesthetically to not, right? I don't know. This is a dilemma I keep going back and forth on. Do I stay true to the aesthetic, or do I do something that has fun R2s and doesn't inflict rot, but just doesn't look quite as buggy? So for now, I'm sticking with Rogier's, but I have the thing upgraded. I have the Antspur Rapier just sitting there in my inventory at plus 17, staring at me. I might get to it someday. Who knows? Anyways, Glintblade Phalanx is like a better version of the modern Glintstone Pebble. And if timed correctly, you can land the follow-up thrust and then true combo that into the Phalanx firing. For a lot of people, this might one-shot them. I have yet to test this in 1.07, and due to the general Ash of War nerf, we shall see if this does the same kind of damage it did before. I also had someone drop me Gideon's Scepter, known as the Scepter of All-Knowing, but despite it being a hammer and having the Morningstar R2s and being longer than the Morningstar, I find myself almost never using it because its damage is so low, and the Ash of War is just not very good or useful or interesting, and it costs a lot of FP. So you'll almost never see me using this. And lastly, I just need to keep the Bastard Stars on me, because while its Ash of War is thematic and celestial, everything else about that weapon is bad, because it's a flail. But I will try in the near future to do something with it, I promise. Alright, we've been spending way too much time talking about a bunch of goddamn melee weapons in the midst of the age of Mage. Let's talk about the spells. On my last video, I got a lot of really great comments, but one of the original Dark Souls 3 mages, known as Hobo Sorcerer, left a very insightful comment that you can still chain cast certain spells into one another. For example, you can chain cast Spiral Shard into pretty much any other Comet type sorcery in the game. This basically fires a torpedo of magic damage right down the center of the spiral you just fired off. Initially I wanted to go full Celian and use Night Comet to chain cast with it, but I ended up going with Glintstone Comet Shard due to its higher damage, lower FP cost, and aesthetic alignment with Spiral Shard. And by aesthetic alignment, I mean it's the same color as Spiral Shard, and thus the casting of Comet Shard gets initially masked by the spell it's chain casted off of, making it just a tad more surprising. So yeah, Comet Shard does a bunch of damage. Not just some damage, a whole metric bunch of damage. It's nice. And the best part is, Comet Shard is only going to get better. 1.7 reduced the amount of FP it costs, and slightly increased its damage. And now I'm just ripping Comet Shards at hosts, who now have to deal with Spiral Shards, Magic Glint Blades, and Glintblade Phalanxes that all now cost less FP and do more damage. And you know what's still really good? Night Maiden's Mist. I've gained quite a few subscribers since my Carian Enforcer build, where I used Night Maiden's Mist quite a bit. So for those of you who are new, Night Maiden's Mist is incredible. It is basically Celian mustard gas, and it can do all the things you want it to do. It can hold choke points, it can hold ladders, it can create space for you. It also has a lingering effect, so even after your target leaves the cloud, they still take damage for a little bit. Here in this invasion, I'm just getting like totally swamped by this party of three. They got madness, they got gravitational spells that pull me closer to that madness. They got everything. They even have Barrier of Gold. This is my worst nightmare. But here comes Night Maiden's Mist. Now I've sectioned off the party. I've gotten the host to come closer to me and closer to the other Astel bug that's going to pelt them with rocks. One of their summons sees that this is going poorly for them and rushes in to help, I guess panics, and runs right off a cliff. The other one, I think, also tries to run in to help, but then ends up getting caught in the mist for too long and tries to run back out. But again, if you leave, you still take a little bit of damage, so they're in it for just long enough to finish them off too. And now this really nasty 3v1 with Barrier of Gold and Madness has now become a very manageable 1v1 with someone using 2 colossal weapons. That's a pretty great matchup for me. And that is the true power of Night Maiden's Mist. Chaos and uncertainty. This build also gets a ton of utility out of its Wondrous Flask of Physic, which seems to be a recurring theme on all of my mage builds thus far. Of course, I'm using the Physic tier that increases magic damage, but I'm also using the Equip Load tier for a light roll. In previous mage builds, I've always had something that has a Get Off Me Ash of War. On the Briar's build, it was Flaming Strike on the Morningstar, and on the Spiral Mage, it was the Dancing Blade on the Marias Greatsword. I don't really have a Get Off Me Ash of War on this build, but I need to be able to deal with 2 or 3 players putting pressure on me, and thus we light roll. If we can't really hold our ground effectively, we must be able to escape effectively, and the light roll is the ticket to do that. That added mobility of light roll allows us to escape terrible things like a Dragon Breath incantation, or other Moonveil users, or dual Naginatas. The list goes on. There are many terrible things in this game, but you either are able to shut those down, or you need to be able to escape. And those are your choices as a mage. Now you might be looking at this build thus far and see my stat spread and assume something. So let's talk about the elephant in the room. Yes, I can use the Moonveil, and yes, I have used it to put down many a host that I deemed quote-unquote really fucking annoying. Back in Dark Souls 3, I happened upon the idea of Find Out swords, essentially the sword that you pull out when someone has fucked around for long enough and now it's time for them to find out. In Elden Ring invasions, you often don't have time to wait around for them to fuck around. So the time to pull out the Find Out sword is the moment you realize they're going to fuck around. So when I see something like pre-1.07 Crouch Poke on a Quick Step Greatsword, the Moonveil comes out. Like I said earlier, the footage you're seeing is from 1.06, so this current fight simply wouldn't happen thanks to the Crouch Poke nerf and the general nerf to Ashes of War that makes the Moonveil damage a little bit less ridiculous now. But what I do like about the Moonveil is that practically every heal is punishable. Just when you think you've made space, I can still hit you with a transient Moonlight. And now that it's 1.07, I will absolutely justify using this weapon since it's a sword forged in Celia, and those people are all about bugs and celestial beings, so boom, your complaints about Moonveil have been shut down with lore. But in all seriousness, I don't love using this weapon at all, and I'm quite happy it's been nerfed to a degree that doesn't really take away what makes this weapon unique. And while sometimes it's nice to have a Find Out sword, it just feels that much more satisfying to win without one. Although situations like the Grace Point right outside of Rykard's sometimes does indeed require the Moonveil, and maybe a little sprinkle of Night Maiden's Mist. Well, I don't really have too much more to say about this build other than that it's basic and it's fun. And that's all I really care about, right? The latter part. Not the fact that it's basic, that still really bothers me. I'm trying to work on that. But I think with some of the changes that 1.07 brought about, there were a ton of different tweaks and buffs to lots of different spells and incantations that I'm really excited to try. So hopefully I'll make a few more kind of off-the-wall mage builds in the next couple of weeks. I'm going to continue to play this game quite a bit. I know some of the stuff has changed, but at its core, it's still a lot of the same general issues with melee combat that I still have. So I'm sticking with my Age of Mage. I'm still pressing ahead with that because that's been just so much fun for me as of late. Yeah, I'm going to take a small little break around Halloween and participate in the Bloodborne event. And while I'm really looking forward to that, I think that's going to be a total blast. I don't really anticipate that interfering with me making builds and continuing to play this game. Oh, and I'm missing like the most important part here, is that they added stuff in this patch to the game's files that are referencing other files that aren't in the game yet, whose files are named DLC, like X, Y, and Z. They added a couple new hairstyles, and they added some new assets to the arenas that we can't yet access. And I think there's references to like 6 other maps, several of which I believe are probably just like arena maps, but also one that people are pretty sure is a dungeon type map, and then a reference to something else that we have no idea what it is. So DLC seems like it's on its way. This is not a Sekiro situation where we're waiting around speculating what the DLC is going to be, and then it just never shows up. No, it's going to be a real thing. I'm so excited that this basically all but confirms that. So yeah, a lot to look forward to. We got the PvP balance changes to play around with right now. Then we got Bloodborne at the end of the month, and then hopefully sometime after that, sometime in the near future, a DLC announcement and a trailer. So yeah, I'm super excited. I hope you guys are too. And I hope you guys are all doing well, because, man, the response to these videos as of late and this whole Age of Mage thing has been super, super encouraging, and I've been really loving getting a chance to get to know a lot more of you guys. So that's been fun. I like this little community. Anyways, I will stop rambling. That's all I got. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.